in March, I did a science fiction TBR, and at that time, The Parable of the Sower was available on Kindle Unlimited. As of this recording, I've read Parable of the Sower and I've finished Parable of Talents as well. We're just going to talk about Parable of the Sower today. Anyone who wants to know, was The Parable of the Sower good? Was it bad? Where did it rank? Let me just tell you, it's a 4-star rating for me. I think after reading Parable of Talents, I might bump it up to a 5-star rating because the duo of them work so well together. But as a standalone, Parable of the Sower does very well at 4 stars. Talking overall formatting of this book, I love this more recent cover with the orange and red silhouette on it with a white background. I think the orange and the red pop out and are really stunning. I think the silhouette they picked is very evocative and thought-provoking, and that kind of goes with the whole founding your own religion, creating rules to live by, maybe even creating a new world from this dystopian nightmare we've fallen into. The internal layout was fine for the Kindle. There wasn't anything I noticed on the ebook format that was really special or that stood out, but I did read this book on a Kindle, on my iPad, and on my iPhone. And using all these different devices, the formatting still looked really nice and sharp on all of them. They have both small indents for paragraphs and some spacing in between paragraphs, and this really helps make it clear where one paragraph starts and the next paragraph begins. I personally find that it's way easier to lose your place on an e-reader, so it's really nice that they had this extra functionality with spaces between paragraphs. Another thing worth mentioning is, like with Dune, there are epigraphs at the beginning of each of the chapters. I am not a fan of the epigraph structure. I think that The Parable of the Sower uses these epigraphs way better than Dune does, because in The Parable of the Sower, it's usually a quote from Lauren's Earthseed, which is this religion that she's founded or that she's discovering. So when we get this quote, it sort of sets like a tone, it indicates a lesson we might be learning in this chapter. It kind of gives us a theme and a mood for what's happening in the chapter. And it also kind of gives us some insight into Lauren, her outlook on the world, and where she thinks the world should be going. Where in Dune, it's just a history book by the Princess Irulan, so it's a major spoiler of whatever is going to happen in the story, and also it's from the perspective of a character I don't give a crap about. Parable of the Sower definitely executes a lot better, makes these epigraphs more meaningful. Does that mean I like them? Not really. It is kind of a clever way to integrate the actual religion and text of Earthseed into this book to give us more context for the religion and to make this new religion Lauren's created feel more real. But I also kind of felt like it was a waste of my time. The Earthseed verses are simple, and there's some elements of that that's nice, like it's very easy to digest poetry, but there's part of me that is sort of like shoulder shrugs. And this thing about the epigraphs kind of leads me into the narrative style overall. We are reading Lauren's journals. So we're getting a first-person perspective, but we're not directly with the character. She's writing something from her recollection after the fact. One of the things I liked about this narrative style is it let us span years with Lauren, and we just got to hit like remarkable moments in history or notable things happening in her own little neighborhood. We didn't have to kind of like stick it out, and Octavia E. Butler wasn't forced to like condense the story into some kind of time period that wasn't realistic. And it was really interesting to see the continued decline of our society. We're in a place that's very different from where we are now. And we're seeing how things like the results of an election or a corporate takeover or a corporate suggestion or the collapse of a certain part of our environment is like accelerating this decline and breakdown in society, where they've already got themselves so cordoned off that like gated neighborhoods are actually walled off. But it can get so much worse, and we do start to get a chance to see how that happens throughout the years, and it feels a lot more natural than like in Meg Ellison's The Book of the Unnamed Midwife. That story is also very post-apocalyptic, dystopian world, descent down into the world, but I think that the way it handles time makes some of the things that are happening in Meg Ellison's story feel unrealistic, where since Octavia Butler has given us like that special magic ingredient of time, helps with that suspension of disbelief and makes everything feel much more real and visceral. The other thing that's cool about having journal entries is it sort of makes Wen its own character, not just who or what, but when becomes really important. You get to see like when election years come up, when we get discoveries in space, when certain elements specifically collapse. It has this extra presence and gravity to it. And I think we're only able to do that through something like journaling or like a collection of news stories. If I had one gripe with the journal entry style story, it's that we're really tied to Lauren's perspective. And I kind of found it confusing sometimes. Especially in the beginning, Lauren was telling me a lot of information that like her was just common knowledge, and for me and other readers would be a lot of catch-up work. So, she's talking about how this is the first time out of her community in a long time, and it's specifically for this baptism, and how she's not into this baptism. It's something that her parents and the old people want, and kids are kind of shoulder shrugged. A lot of the kids are excited because they don't get to go outside a lot, and they like to see outside. Lauren doesn't like it because outside is horrific. And some of the things she's describing is making me wonder why the other kids want to see it. But I do know that it felt very strange. And it was hard for me to get a beat on Lauren's age. She's going for a baptism, but she's talking to me about how she likes to have sex. It was really shocking to me the ages that children were having sex in this world. And it was also really shocking to me that these people were having so many children. Like, I know that birth control probably isn't easy for them to access in this particular world. And this book was published in 1993, so access to birth control was like less than it is now. And especially since they're suffering like all this overcrowding and food insecurity and all these other things, partially a symptom of too many kids combined with not enough safe places for them to grow out and expand and really thrive. I was just like,
these people are not very smart. They're not really thinking this through.
I also found it really difficult to reconcile how Lauren perceived her stepmother with how I immediately perceived her. Like when she was introduced, I thought like,
Lauren's stepmother doesn't really like Lauren, and she's not a very good mother if she has an obvious favorite child.
Through Lauren's writing, I realized that Lauren felt like this stepmother was actually her mother and was a really good stepmother to her. And I was like,
okay, well, my perceptions are wrong. I have to readjust.
And then we get to another part of the story, and Lauren's stepmother just comes out and is
like, you were never my daughter, and I didn't want you.
And it was like, okay, so I was right all the time. So what was all this like back and forth perception stuff going on? There's some stuff about like first cousins being in relationships and that being fine, which kind of squicked me out. I guess what this book taught me is that I'm a little bit more uptight than I thought I was, because it was describing a lot of things like every day in common, and I just thought that was like weird and way out of my experience level and not something I could see happening hypothetically. So some first impressions in this book, I went in braced for impact. I have read a couple of Octavia E. Butler short stories before, and I found them really intense. And personally, I've been sort of avoiding post-apocalyptic dystopian style stories because I've been so anxious about the world around me and what's been going on in our larger world that I wasn't entirely sure I was going to be able to finish this book. I was kind of wrong. Like, I found it really easy to read The Parable of the Sower. It was breezy. I didn't feel as connected to the characters or the events. I didn't find them as upsetting or overwhelming as I thought I was going to. And I feel like that's both a good and a bad thing because, from my perspective, it was great because I really enjoyed my read. It was enough interesting philosophical moments for me to like have a fun time, to think about it and talk some parts over with my husband, and not so much that I had to like take long breaks in between reading and like build out with like some other fluffy stuff. But on the other side, like a little bit, you want that kind of like hard to read intensity in a dystopian apocalypse, and part of the reason I wasn't getting that is I just didn't feel super connected to these characters. Like, I cared about them, but I wasn't so invested that I would have been upset if any one of them had died, really. I don't know, I just felt like I didn't know the characters very well. I had some ideas about their background histories, I had some ideas about like what they were leaving and, that they were hoping to survive and maybe even thrive in this world, and had no idea how to do that. They were just like sort of stumbling around looking for a safe place. It wasn't a bad thing, it just meant that for me, they were like theoretical like paper dolls you're playing with. And how connected can you be to a paper doll? You know, it's just sort of flat and there and moving throughout the world. As far as like a great thought piece goes, very useful to have characters that are a little bit more muted. And I think possibly because of the kind of environment these characters found themselves in, it was hard for them to have like that larger than life, explosive kind of personality. I think a little bit they had to make themselves more small and malleable. And I guess to be fair, like there were ways these characters were exceptional to other people in the story, like their level of empathy, their willingness to help, the fact that they were still hoping to find community and that they hadn't given up and become criminals or turned on each other was all sort of an exception. So if I had to describe the book and my overall reading experience, I'd say The Parable of the Sower is a near future dystopia with strong thematic similarities to both Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale and Meg Ellison's The Road to Nowhere series. We experience the end of our civilization with a stubborn character called Lauren who intends to survive, but she also confronts people and the dangers of the world around her with honest vulnerability and compassion. Parable of the Sower has a narrative tone that reminded me heavily of Atlas Shrugged, and that's not to say that thematically the two of them are similar, because they're not, but storytelling-wise, I think the religious zealotry mindset that Lauren has, combined with prose where she sometimes explains concepts for too long, like are moralizing and preachy, I think it's impossible to have that and to avoid falling into a bit of that libertarian dream that Atlas Shrugged is sharing. It's got like a bootstrappy feel, and it's also got a little bit of like a self-righteous,
me, I'm right, I know what's going on
moral tilt. And the story plays that out. Like, Lauren doesn't just think she's right and then turns out to be wrong. Lauren thinks she's right, and like a prophecy, she almost always calls it the right way. And this is kind of the same way that you see Dagny acting in Atlas Shrugged. She doesn't just think she's right, and it's not just all the other characters talking about how she's right and wonderful. Like, she goes out and she does all the things with minimal strain. It's fun. I'm not knocking it. It's just something that reminded me about the two stories. Parable of the Sower also borrows formatting from Dune, and Lauren has a little bit of that Messiah thing going on that Paul does. It's part of like the whole religion element. Paul's leading his people into some sort of salvation or survival situation, and Lauren is doing the same thing for her band of misfits. Parable of the Sower also has a great sense of place. They are walking along the highways for the back half of the book, and it gives a real Grapes of Wrath or even American Gods road trip style feel. Like you can place where it is on a map. If you wanted to, you could drive the same path that Lauren walked. And I always think that's like really interesting in a story, to go to the same places the characters went, see what it's like there, and compare it to what it was described like in the book. So let's talk a little bit about the God of Change. Parable of the Sower is deeply religious and philosophical material, and I was hooked from the first line where Lauren writes, "At least 3 years ago, my father's God stopped being my God. His church stopped being my church. And yet today, because I'm a coward, I let myself be initiated into that church. I let my father baptize me in all three names of that God, who isn't mine anymore. My God has another name." I was down. I was so excited because I love an alternative take on faith that's non-Christian and non-monotheistic ideally. And for me personally, that was like a bonding moment between Lauren and I, where I was with her from the start. And to be honest, Lauren spends a lot of time like being nervous about it and holding back what she has to say. And I was kind of underwhelmed when she finally comes out and just says that she sees God as change. Like, it works really well in this story. So I'm not going to complain about it from that venue, and it does have a lot of interesting applications, specifically in the Parable of the Sower universe, and we really get to see more of that in Parable of Talent. I don't know that I would be defending it at all if it wasn't for the Parable of Talents. Like, it sort of gets established here in Parable of the Sower, and I thought it was like not radical enough to be worth all the fuss, and not that interesting, to be honest. I didn't necessarily agree or disagree with anything she said. I saw how she came to those conclusions. I saw why that was working for her and why it would work for people in this world. It wasn't pushing things far enough, and maybe it would have have been different if I had come from like a more Christian-centered worldview. To hear this would have been very radical. I think especially the thing that I didn't like about it was how Lauren like kept all that Baptist preaching and all that like trying to convert people, and I found all of that to be pretty manipulative and underhanded. It's like great that you can be part of her community and you don't have to believe in her earth seed or whatever. But it's not so great that she doesn't want anyone to have any other faith beliefs. Like, you got to keep those faith beliefs to yourself. You can never say them. It reminded me a lot of don't ask, don't tell as a policy for the US Armed Forces, where for a long time you could be gay or lesbian in the armed forces as long as you never told anyone that you were. Like, it's just dumb. Either it's a problem or it's not. And if you're threatened by other people saying they don't believe in Earthseed and this is their faith and why they believe it, then like your faith is just not that strong and your concept's not that good, and maybe you should fix that. Also, I just hate manipulative preaching, rhetoric in general, and like all the earmarks of it. I find all of that super distasteful. And it's not just a way of public speaking, it's specifically a religious methodology, and you can like go through and find the different pauses and the different kinds of like metaphors and turns of phrases and wording you use. And I'm not a fan that she adopted all that into her new religion. The name Earthseed though is really good, and I love that the religion is called Earthseed and all the people are meant to be seeds planted throughout the stars. And we're reading the parable of the sower, who is the person planting those seeds. And Lauren is literally sowing her faith into these other people to spread across Earth and hopefully the stars. That metaphor was really strong and the extended use of it was great. Love that for her. I also think the parable of the sower makes excellent use of history. The idea that the homeless and dispossessed people would rally against gated communities and would champion basically drugged out terrorists as destroying these communities so they could raid them. All of that made sense. The fact that someone who's just like half a step on the ladder but is also suffering and in poverty is the only person you can get at, so you tear them down just to try to get that little extra day of survival in. The incredible tragedy of that too, that really all of these people, the homeless, the people barely hanging on in the gated community, these drug addicts, they all need to band together and take down corporations and take down like these rich people who are in these isolated colonies. They're too busy fighting amongst themselves just for that like half step up, for that extra day, that they can't continue to push forward and address who's really responsible for keeping them oppressed and starving. I love that we continue to point out how important reading is and how many of these people in this new society are illiterate and that they have to pay like for lessons to learn to read, or they have to pay for someone to read and write for them or to do messages for them. All of that kind of stuff, and like having knowledge being so incredibly valuable in this new society was a wonderful touch, and I loved how Octavia E. Butler kind of like incorporated it in. It wasn't ever really like preachy or overbearing. It was just like,
well, nobody could read, so they didn't know what directions were. They didn't know if they could eat this, and I could, so they had to keep me around just so I could keep telling them the directions.
I love the implementation of the factory towns. I think that's a really interesting element in American history and global history in general. The idea that those would spring back up again and that people would welcome them in because they have so much instability in their life is all like an interesting and engaging topic. Some wishes I had for the book. While the world building in Parable of the Sower was top tier, and I sincerely appreciate how the book uses journal entries to span years of time and give us a better impression of how and why things collapse, I really wish we had like the missing link between our world that stands now and the world that Lauren is in. I think if you keep in mind that this was published in 1993, it makes more sense, but it took me a while to like look up when this was published. The whole time I was reading it, I was thinking like,
if dramatic climate change happened today, would we collapse this way? What other factors would have to happen to make the US fall this way?
And I just think that we have enough reserves, we have enough invested in alternative energy and homesteading and all of that kind of stuff at this point in time that we could probably rally together and make something work. And like, I kind of wish Lauren wasn't right all the time. Mostly it's good that she's right because she's the main character. We're rooting for her, and if she's wrong, everybody dies. Her ability to predict things felt prophetic in a space where there wasn't that kind of mysticism. Everything else was really grounded, but this one girl who'd never been out in the world before was just able to read this room right and knew what to do and where to go and who to trust and when to get out of Dodge. I know she studied for it. I know that she had hyper empathy, which made her really sensitive to other people's like little physical tells when they were talking, their tone, their gestures, all of this like help. But at the same time, the book is long enough where you're like,
all right, where's the time where Lauren messes up?
Like, I think for me, the point where it got to be too much, she looks at Bankel for the first time and she sees like an attractive older black man who smiles at her, and she knows that he's going to be part of their group. She just like has a feeling about him. And she also knows that there's something that he's not telling them, and eventually he's gonna break and tell her. Like the fact that she just knows all of this, and it just like bump, a bump, a bump is right, like A to B to C, no hitch or anything. At that point in the novel, just felt really like jarring. It kind of took me out of everything. That she could be so right about everyone and everything all the time. Now I've got a couple of things I want to talk about that are spoiler elements. So if you don't want any spoilers, here's where you jump off. Halfway through this book, everyone we come to know and feel invested in gets murdered. Lauren was going to leave them anyhow, so a lot of people might not think it's like a great loss that all these people were killed off. But Curtis in particular was a blow, considering that he was probably going to go with Lauren. And I was really looking forward to his reaction to her whole Earthseed religion and her whole feeling of purpose, because they had sort of built that up. Like, she had a chance to tell him and she was like, now's not the right time. I'll tell him later about my hyper empathy. I'll tell him later about my Earthseed thing.
I was like, all right, I can't wait to see Curtis's expression.
And then Curtis is dead, so I'm never gonna know. And you know, it was also really sad for all of her brothers to be dead, for all that just to be abruptly cut out. It's different for them to be dead than for her to be leaving them. Overall, this abrupt destruction of everything Lauren knew that kind of forces her on the road a little earlier really worked for me. I thought like it was a really great way to show that this world is very unpredictable, no matter all the plans, no matter if you have a society working together, no matter if you've got walls in a community, it can all just go away in a flash. But it was a huge risk for Octavia E. Butler to kill everybody off. And I think for her to take this risk and execute it so well just shows what an amazing writer she is, and I wanted to give it a little shout out. Making it to Bankel's land and having his sister and her family dead was kind of crushing. It was a little bit of an unexpected gut punch for me. I knew what I was reading, and things had been getting pretty grim. But at the same time, I kind of thought like
maybe the land was protected enough.
Bankel had like spoken to her and her husband recently, so I felt like
surely they will be fine.
Or maybe they will have been robbed, but otherwise will be alive. And too, like, I thought that Bankel's sister and how she responded to Lauren would have been an interesting dynamic in the story going forward. Like, if she was resistant to Lauren's place in Bankel's life, or if she was, like, established on the land and kind of the leader and feeling like this is my land, my place, I tell you what to do and how things go. It could have been like an interesting obstacle for Lauren to navigate with her whole Earthseed compound plans. And all of that kind of gets just like thrown out in the wash. I mean, on the flip side, if Bankel's sister and family had been alive, it would have been a little bit like at the end of the most recent War of the Worlds movie, where Tom Cruise finds his wife and his wife's grandparents and his son, who left in an explosion of fire, all completely unharmed in Boston. And in a neighborhood in Boston that looked like it had never been touched by any kind of war. Like, it's a little unbelievable, right? And it's a little dream sequency to unreal after we've just done that gruesome slog. I know meeting more hyper empaths was foreshadowed early in this book. When we finally had the reveal that several of Lauren's traveling companions were hyper empaths, it took me completely by surprise. I didn't recognize any tells or anything about them that would have given away that they had hyper empathy, and I didn't really see what the point was to assigning those people also the same hyper empathetic condition. Like, Lauren's hyper empathy allows her to do certain kinds of things and is a certain weakness that she has to overcome in X, Y, and Z ways. but I'm not getting that same feeling from the others. I don't know, I guess I'm just curious to see where this hyper empathy goes, what kind of role that plays within the Earthseed faith, if it has like any use or any major drawback. As it stands right now, it's kind of shoulder shruggy, and I'm hoping it goes someplace in book 2, which I've already read The Parable of Talents by the time I'm recording this, but I'm not going to spoil anyone by telling them what happens in it. Overall, I loved this story. I think it's really interesting that the timeline is happening like 2015, 2016. These are the years that Lauren is recording in this first book, and they're years that we've recently just lived through. And I had some enjoyment comparing like my 2015 with Lauren's 2015, and I think that's kind of a fun element about this book today. Yeah, but have you read Parable of the Sower? Did you like it or not? Let me know in those comments down below. And let me know if you consider this book a American classic, because I personally consider this a science fiction American classic, and I consider Octavia E. Butler a classic author, even though she's a little bit more contemporary. But I'd be curious to know where you stand in this debate and what you feel about calling this book specifically a classic already. Thanks for watching, and as always,